This is segment 2 of Module 4 on gender and health, and in this segment we'll just talk very briefly about some of the paradoxical patterning in health outcomes by gender. As I mentioned before, when we're talking about gender here, we'll mostly be framing it in terms of two paradoxes based on empirical patterns in the literature. And the first is the observation that women have lower mortality, longer life expectancy, but appear to have higher morbidity, or it's often assumed that they have higher morbidity than men, and that assumption part of it is why that dimension of this paradox has a question mark after it. We'll talk more about that momentarily. And the second of the two paradoxes is that women's social disadvantage relative to men does not translate into physical disadvantage and health outcomes, at least in terms of mortality and life expectancy. So for this segment, we'll just deal with the first of these two paradoxes. This graph depicts the gap over time narrowing in life expectancy at birth between men and women. So what you see here is from 1979 up to 2004, that while there's an overall trend in increasing life expectancy for both sexes, this gap between women and men is narrowing over time. What you don't see that's going on prior to 1979 is a widening of this gap in life expectancy by sex. And what that's thought to reflect is greater survival among women due to the ability to prevent early mortality related to pregnancy and childbirth, and excess mortality among men in this earlier period due to behavioral factors like differential uptake and smoking. So what you see over here with this narrowing is often assumed to be the steadiness, relatively speaking, of male mortality met with a compression or suppression of increased gains in life expectancy among women due to the lagged effects of a later uptake of health behaviors such as smoking that have led to high degrees of excess mortality among both men and women. In the Montez article that you have that was required for this module, you can see some interesting patterns emerging here when we break down mortality, here looking only at men across ages and by level of educational attainment. This and the next graph don't give you a direct comparison of mortality among men and women, but they do show how trends in mortality with education and age are showing up to be different for men and women. So here what you see is, of course, increasing mortality with age, and at each age level, but more apparent in older ages, you see a social gradient in mortality, with higher mortality among those with less than high school education relative to higher levels of attainment. But what you see for each age group, and particularly where most of the mortality is happening at the upper ages, you see that at least for each educational group, the trend over time, the 3 points represent different time points, as shown here, 1986 up to 2006. You see a decrease over time in mortality for every age group and every age level of education attainment. And the contrast is what you see when you look at the same patterning among white women. So here you see, again, greater levels of mortality with increasing age, and you see a gradient at every level of age. But what you see here is that among those with less than a high school education, you're not seeing improvements over time. You're not seeing decreases in mortality over these 3 time periods. In fact, you're actually seeing something most apparently here. It looks like an increasing mortality trend with time among women with less than a high school education. And that's really something that's got a lot of attention lately. The Montez article is just one take on those trends, and I chose it because I think it nicely illustrates many of the things and concepts we've been talking about as they've attempted to explain this repeated evidence in the empirical literature that white women with less than a high school education are falling behind, and trying to tease out the different ideologic or artifactual interpretations of those patterns, whether it's a selection process or something about changes over time in the meaning and implications of educational attainment for mortality outcomes. So that's somewhat of a digression. The general takeaway point here, though, is men's mortality is greater than women's. Women's life expectancy is greater than men's. And even though you can observe fluctuations in the level of differences in the gaps between the sexes over time, you see that what's fairly consistent is the pattern of women's greater survival relative to men's. What's clear is that you see a consistent pattern of women's greater survival relative to men's. So the other part of this paradox is that women's morbidity exceeds that of men's. Now, rather than going through all of the complexity of various health outcomes, of course, these are restricted to ones that apply both to men and women. This is a snapshot of the outcomes which in general are assumed or shown to be more prevalent among men or women. And what you can see here is that it's far from obvious that those among women exceed those of men. So paradox gets a little bit, I think, questionable. And sometimes we're talking about prevalence, magnitude of prevalence differences on particular health outcomes, whereby, for example, with things like migraines, depression, autoimmune diseases, and so forth, women's prevalence exceeds men's by a significant magnitude such that they're considered to have higher morbidity. Whereas the range of outcomes here among where men's prevalence is higher than that of women's is more significant. There are more of them. Although there are important exceptions. So here, for example, with coronary heart disease and hypertension, prevalence among men is higher than that among women, except at older ages, usually post-menopause. Another exception is even things like substance abuse here. Overall, with substance use and abuse, prevalence is higher among men, but when you break that down by subcategories, you'd find that it also is more complicated. For example, there have been recent reports of really high levels of substance abuse and mortality from prescription drugs that are abused among women relative to men, and that prevalence of that particular type of substance use and abuse is much, much higher among women relative to men, and it's a fairly recent phenomenon. So even though this paradox, which is the minor paradox compared to what we'll spend most of the time focusing on, is often assumed to be the case, the actual picture makes it much more complicated than what is often assumed. And when this paradox, apparent or assumed paradox, is explained, often what you see invoked are things that rather come across as sort of stereotypes or reflect sort of gender differences around willingness to report symptoms, their utilization of health services, which is fairly consistently shown to be differential by gender. But some of this, like stoicism and willingness to just report differences on surveys and so forth, is somewhat more just suggestive and stereotypical, as is the idea that women are factoring in less serious problems when they're self-assessing their health. So, for example, on self-reported health measures, women's prevalence of fair or poor health is usually higher than men's. And the idea here is that when women are self-assessing their health, they're factoring in things that are more trivial and less related to actual manifest objective morbidity or subsequent mortality. A test of this interpretation in 2008 looked at the logical conclusion from that assumption, which is that if women overreport, then the morbidity-mortality association among women should be weaker than that among men. And when tested about self-reported morbidity and its predictive power for mortality by gender, this assumption, this test, was shown to be false. And that's the end of segment 2.